Okay, 5 things about Candy. 1, he's desperate for companionship. So this cluster of adverbs here, unhappily, nervously, helplessly, uneasily, hopelessly, they come at the moment at which his dog is being sort of torn away from him. And I don't think that's a hyperbolic way of describing it, because I think that separation of Candy from his dog is an incredibly traumatic event. And Candy, he shares with this dog a kind of closeness, a physical intimacy, but also a companionship that goes back many years. So I've had him since he was a pup. He was the best sheepdog. That's what Candy says. And I think all of these adverbs come within sort of maybe 2 or 3 paragraphs when Carlson is taking that dog, or saying that he wants to take the dog, and Candy looks hopelessly at that Slim for some reversal, but doesn't get it, does he? Secondly, Candy lay rigidly on his bed, staring at the ceiling. This comes a little bit later, then he rolled slowly over and faced the wall and lay silent. Now, Steinbeck, throughout the novella, it uses the symbolism of movement to represent either distance or closeness from something or someone. And here, Candy's obviously closing himself off. You can see that through him staring at the ceiling. He's lying rigidly as though he's sort of closed and shutting himself off from other people. He rolls over towards the wall. And a wall isn't somewhere that you can look to for a great deal of promise, is it? It's just a wall, isn't it? You can't get through a wall. And so I think that wall, you've got to kind of work out what you think that represents, because I think there's a little bit of symbolism there as well. And characters don't open up often in the novel, do they? So Crooks, remember, was initially resistant when Lenny comes to his room. Doesn't want him anywhere near there. Candy as well, when he comes to Crooks's room to begin with, is sort of tentative and cautious about entering into Crook's space. And of course, when Candy's dog is taken away from him, maybe this is Candy's attempt to sort of shut himself off, because if he can sort of not be connected to anybody else, not form those relationships with anybody else, then the chances of feeling the trauma, suffering, the pain that he feels at that moment, the chances of that happening again are very slim. But he does very quickly turn slowly over. So once the other men have left, and George and Lenny are talking about their dream, George relays the dream to Lenny. Candy at this point lets go of that protective layer. And is that a sign, the fact that it happens so quickly, is that a sign of how desperate Candy is for some form of companionship, some form of unity? He wants to be part of something, doesn't he? And so even at his lowest point, the point at which his longest and greatest friend has been harshly taken away from him, Candy reaches out and wants to be part of something new. So first thing, desperate for companionship, Candy. Secondly, he's insecure about his age and his disability. That's $350 I put in. I'd make a will and leave my share to you guys. Okay. Now, what we've got to ask ourselves is why Candy, why is he giving so much money so quickly to people that he barely knows? And I wonder if it's something to do with the state of society in 1930s America. The only way that Candy can reassure these men that he's going to be of some use to them, because of his age, because of his disability, is through some kind of financial contribution. So he can only compensate for his ineptitude by putting up this money that he has. But he also realizes that actually he's not going to get these men, George and Lenny, to trust him unless he can provide some kind of financial and legal safeguard. And so he references that contractual arrangement of a will to leave his share of the ranch, of this barn, this place that they want to buy together. He's also constantly apologetic. I don't know if you noticed, but when they're talking about the dream, when Candy's offering his money, he says, "I ain't much good, but," look at how many times he says that. It's quite a fair number. And so he's sort of prefacing all of the things that he says with this disclaimer that he isn't much good. So he's really like overly conscious of the fact that his age and his disability hold him back. And he's totally aware that that productivity in 1930s America is the primary concern. Can we make enough money to survive? And if you're not useful, and I guess you could call this a kind of utilitarian outlook, the way in which people are utilities, things to be used, and Candy realizes that he isn't of much utility to the people around him. They'll can be pretty soon, he says. And I've put down here at the bottom, Slim's already spoken Candy's fate, hasn't he? When they talk about the dog and whether or not it should be shot. Because Slim says, I wish somebody'd shoot me if I get old and a cripple. And that's a kind of really quite morbid and dark signifier of Candy's fate. And I know Candy doesn't get shot, but it's sort of symbolic of the way in which Candy is viewed by people in 1930s America. People look like of Carlson's ilk. Number 3, he's powerless, trying to be powerful. So our first description of Candy, 3 adjectives are used to pre-modify the noun man. Tall, which might seem, actually, that sounds like someone who's quite strong and powerful, but I'll get to that in a second. Stoop-shouldered and old. Now, old speaks for itself. His age holds him back because he's not as good at doing manual labour as people like Slim and George, who are much younger. Stoop-shouldered tells us that he's not kind of standing up straight, so his back is bent. And coming back to that adjective tall, well, does that sort of exacerbate the sense in which Candy is disabled? Because if he's taller, then the extent to which he is hunched over and disabled, well, that means that it's sort of more so, isn't it? So it's heightened by the fact that Steinbeck has clustered these adjectives together. Candy, this is the moment where Curly comes in, and just before Curly sees Lenny laughing and goes or smiling and goes over and picks a fight with him. Candy joined the attack with joy, glove full of Vaseline, he said disgustedly. Curly glared at him. And notice here, this is a weird kind of sort of power dynamic at this point, because Curly is up there at the top of the kind of social hierarchy within the ranch. He's the boss's son, and so he has financial and economic clout, but he's also handy. And hands in the novel are symbols of power. And Curly's a sort of champion boxer. Candy himself has told us that earlier. Candy, on the other hand, has a wrist stump, so he doesn't have one of his hands. So it's a bit strange, isn't it, that the character that we associate with weakness, Candy, finds an opportunity to attack Curly, who's handy, who's powerful. And I guess the question should be, how does Steinbeck reconcile this with his hand symbolism throughout the novella? Well, what happens to Curly immediately after this attack on Curly's kind of masculinity and his status on the ranch? It comes from Candy, but it also comes from the other men that are surrounding him. What happens to him? Lenny crushes his hand. And so that act of crushing, that plot device, of course, it serves to kind of sort of build on this ongoing tension between Curly and Lenny. But it also shows us that some kind of defeat has taken place, some kind of wresting of power, Candy taking power from Curly, perhaps. This is when Lenny's talking to Crooks about what Candy's up to in the bunkhouse. So he just sits in the bunkhouse, sharpening his pencil and sharpening and figuring. And the question for us should be, why is he sharpening his pencil? That might seem like a weird, insignificant question. But I guess it's this sort of, it represents the plans that Candy has for the future, doesn't it? The sharpening of a pencil indicates the start of new thinking, of imagination, of creativity, and promise of opportunity. Except that is all he's doing. He's sharpening his pencil and sharpening and figuring. It's as if Candy can't really kind of get thinking about get thinking about the dream. Although, having said that, I was just thinking, the fact that he's sharpening his pencil and sharpening and figuring, maybe, he has to keep sharpening it because he's got so many ideas and he's writing them all down. And so he's sort of obsessed with the prospect of this new place that Lenny and George and Candy can get together and buy. Worth thinking about that and what the significance of the pencil is. Finally, on this page, powerless, trying to be powerful, but a change came over old Candy. He stood up suddenly and knocked his nail keg over backward. He was master of the situation. This is the moment where Curly's wife has come into Crook's space and is challenging Crooks and Lenny and Candy about how Curly hurt his hand. And at this moment, Candy attempts to seize control from Curly's wife. And he does succeed temporarily. So it's really interesting to look at this scene where there's sort of this to and fro in terms of power. Curly's wife comes in and says, "Oh, look, they left all the weak ones here," doesn't she? And this interaction between the four of them is this moment of them all trying to kind of gain power over the other one. They're all weak, but they all recognise that they've got something to offer in terms of that battle for status and power. After this, there's a long, passionate monologue from Candy in which he attacks Curly's wife. So he's powerless, but he's trying to be powerful. And I think on the next couple of slides, we'll see that actually after this monologue, after he tries to assert authority, he is crushed very quickly. Number 4, then, he's resentful and bitter. So this is the moment he discovers Curly's wife in the barn. Dead. You goddamn tramp, he said viciously. And at this moment, I think Candy, he's looking for a scapegoat, isn't he? Someone to blame. And Curly's wife obviously is an easy target. But Steinbeck, I think, captures through lots of his novels this sense of the victim, the people who have been deprived of dignity and fulfillment, and that sense of bitterness, resentment, anger towards those that have deprived them of that fulfillment. And sort of Candy represents this really well at this moment because he has had something cruelly taken away from him. And we feel a great deal of emotion, I think, for Candy at this moment, particularly in this next quote that I've got down here. His eyes blinded with tears, he turned and went weakly out of the barn, and he rubbed his bristly whiskers with his wrist stump. And that's hugely emotive, isn't it? We get a sense of his utter despair with that phrase, eyes blinded with tears. But also Steinbeck wants to point us back towards that sort of representation of Candy's weakness and powerlessness, in that he rubbed his bristly whiskers with his wrist stump. We'll get to this in the next slide, but Steinbeck wants to repeat again and again these stock phrases that indicate something about the person. And Candy's wrist stump is one of those. This is weird, but I noticed this when I was preparing for this video. Candy lay down in the hay and covered his eyes with his arm. This is after the men have gone off to go and find Lenny. So Curly's wife's still there, and he sort of looks her in the face, I think, at that moment. And then he lies down and covers his eyes with his arm. Why? Is it just Steinbeck again sort of hinting at Candy's arm, and that idea of like his weakness and powerlessness? Or is him kind of lying down in the hay a symbol of kind of defeat and death and decay? Curly's wife is lying down in the hay and she's dead, and now Candy lies down as well. Worth thinking about that, why Steinbeck includes that, because there must be a reason. Number 5, he's ultimately resigned to his inevitable fate. So this first quote comes after that long monologue from Curly's to Curly's wife when he's angry at her, and she says, nobody had listened. She says, sorry, that if that she would she'd accuse crooks of doing something untoward towards her, and then they pipe up and say, well, we tell everyone that you framed crooks, and then she says, well, nobody had listened to you. And Candy subsides, interesting use of verb, and he agreed, so he's compliant and submissive here. He even repeats what she says, so no, nobody had listened to us. He gives in, doesn't he? So he kind of realises that she's the victor here, that she does hold more power in the end. He looked about helplessly and he rubbed his beard. And this is the moment at which he discovers Curly's wife in the barn. And I said in the previous slide, but Steinbeck uses these phrases again and again with his characters, perhaps to show how Candy's destiny is mapped out from the beginning. So that phrase helplessly is an adverb used to describe him as his dog is being taken away from him at the beginning. And he rubbed his beard. It happens again and again whenever Candy's slightly anxious about something. And so maybe there's a sense in which he's foreshadowing at the beginning, but also they're markers to make us look back and realise the inevitability of this, the failure of their dream. Now, Candy spoke his greatest fear. You and me can get that little place, can't we, George? You and me can go there and live nice, can't we, George? Can't we? Look at the superlative greatest. What is Candy's greatest fear? What are his hopes and dreams? And I wonder if there's something there. Obviously, it's economic security and safety and a place to live. But there's something about the unity and companionship that he feels that this dream could have offered him. You and me, we, that repetition. Can't we? There's something inherent to this dream that's about being with others and social intimacy. I think this quote is well worth looking at in an essay about Candy. He knew. So George didn't even really need to kind of tell him that this wasn't a possibility. And this short sentence is one of the kind of biggest indicators of the harsh reality of 1930s America. That sort of realization that actually success was always going to be impossible for Candy, an old, disabled man who has no kind of use or worth to anybody, apart from his dog, who's been horribly taken away from him. So there you go, 5 things about Candy.